Cruiser is on fire, not smoldering, not smoking. Burning orange flames, clawing through blizzard snow at 11,000 feet. The kind of fire that doesn't care about the cold. Inside, a woman is still alive. She's a cop. She has evidence that could bring down half the town government. And the men who ran her off this mountain roads are already circling back to make sure the fire finishes what they started. They think this is over. They have no idea who lives up here. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is where the stories that Hollywood hasn't touched yet come to life. Miss a single one. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go back to the mountain. The storm had been for 6 hours before it became something else entirely. By the time Claire Maddox turned her cruiser onto Blackridge Pass, the snow wasn't falling anymore. It was moving, horizontal and mean, driving itself into the windshield with the kind of personal anger that only Wyoming winter carries. The wipers were losing. The defroster was losing. The road itself had disappeared, somewhere between mile marker 14 and wherever she was now, replaced by a white void that the headlights punched into, uselessly, 2 pale cones swallowed by nothing. She had her hand on the radio twice before she put it back on the wheel. Twice. The first time was when the visibility dropped below 20 feet. The second time was when she noticed the headlights in her rear view, a pair of them, sitting back far enough to be careful, close enough to still be there. Call it in. She'd almost said it out loud, almost. But she knew who would answer. She knew which dispatcher was pulling overnight this weekend. And she knew which dispatcher had a brother-in-law who worked freight scheduling for Crane Transport LLC, which meant she knew absolutely nothing about who would actually receive that call once it left her lips. So she kept driving. The USB drive was tucked inside the zippered pocket of her duty vest, pressed against her ribs. She could feel it there, a small rectangular weight. 4 months of work, but 3 dead ends, two near misses. And one night, 3 weeks ago, when she'd sat in her car outside the municipal records office for 40 minutes before she finally went inside. The drive felt heavier than it was. It always did lately. Claire was 31 years old. She'd been a Cedar Hollow County deputy for 6 years, had applied twice for detective, and been passed over twice, and had spent the last 4 months running an off-books investigation into freight irregularities on Blackridge Pass that her supervisor had told her twice nicely the first time. Less nicely the second was not her concern. She had a way of disagreeing with people about what her concern was. Her German Shepherd, Ranger, was caged in the rear compartment. Normally, he was restless on long drives, shifting his weight, whining at passing vehicles, generally making his opinion of travel known to everyone within earshot. Tonight he was quiet. He'd been quiet since they left the records annex in Ridgewood, 40 miles back, and Claire found his silence more unsettling than his noise would have been. She glanced in the mirror, not at the headlights this time, at him. He was sitting completely still, facing forward, ears slightly forward and tilted. She said quietly. He didn't look at her. Pass narrowed here. She knew this stretch. Everybody who drove Blackridge knew it a series of S-curves, carved along the eastern face of the ridge, where the road was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the guardrail on the right had been replaced. Twice in 8 years after trucks went through it. Below those guardrails was a slope that dropped 200 feet through black timber before it became anything you could call flat ground. She eased off the gas. The headlights behind her did not ease off. They came up fast suddenly, violently fast, warning, hesitation, as though the driver had simply decided, and the impact hit the rear quarter panel of her cruiser like a punch from something massive, something with 4,000 pounds behind it. And for a fraction of a second, Claire experienced that specific horror of a vehicle refusing to respond to its driver, the wheel turning and the car going straight, the tires finding no grip on ice. Then the guardrail was there, and then it wasn't. And then there was nothing beneath her but air and dark and the beginning of a very long fall. She screamed. She didn't decide to, it just came out. Cruiser hit the slope nose first, bounced, rolled left onto its side, rolled again, caught on something, a boulder or a tree trunk, she couldn't tell, and stopped. The windshield was gone. The roof had compressed 2 inches on the driver's side. One headlight was still functioning and pointing straight up into the falling snow, a single pale beam aimed at nothing. Then the fuel line ruptured. She smelled it before she saw it: gasoline and something burning, and then the orange light started at the front of the engine compartment and began spreading quickly, hungrily, finding the undercarriage and the wheel wells, and moving back toward the passenger compartment with the methodical confidence of fire that knows it has time. Claire's seatbelt was the only reason she was still coherent. She was hanging sideways in it, shoulder pressed against the driver's door, which was now the floor, a gash on her temple, the running blood down into her left eye. Her left arm wasn't working right. She could feel it, but couldn't trust it. Some deep muscular rebellion happening below the shoulder. Her service weapon was still in its holster. Small mercies. Ranger. She reached back toward the cage partition with her right arm. Cage door had held, they were built to hold, but the frame had bent and the latch mechanism was jammed. Her voice came out wrong, wet and strange. Ranger, come. A sound from the back, not a bark. Something lower, more urgent. I know, buddy. I know. Hold on. She got the seatbelt loose, fell the wrong way, caught herself on the collapsed steering wheel, and started working the cage latch with one functional hand, while the fire moved steadily backward along the undercarriage, and the temperature inside the cruiser was already rising in a way that had nothing to do with the heater. The latch didn't want to move. The latch didn't want to move. It was bent at a 15-degree angle where the roll had distorted the frame, and every time she got leverage, the bent metal slipped and her hand came away. She could hear Ranger now, his nails on the cage floor, his breathing high and rapid. I've got you, she said. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. The latch gave on the fourth try. Ranger came through the gap immediately. Not graceful, he fell into the front compartment, and she caught his weight badly with her bad arm and gasped. But she held him. He was breathing. He was alive. He had a gash above his left shoulder that was bleeding onto her uniform jacket. They needed to be out of the vehicle, right now. The passenger door was above them, and she got it open by bracing her back against the door below and pushing with both legs. And the cold came in staggering. Immediate cold. A Wyoming blizzard at elevation cold that she felt in the back of her throat on the first breath. And she pulled Ranger up and through and followed him out, and they both half fell, climbed down the exterior of the overturned cruiser until they hit snow. The snow was deep, waist deep in places. The wind was screaming. Claire stood barely and looked back at the cruiser. The fire was at the rear compartment now. Black smoke was pouring upward and being shredded immediately by the wind. On the road above, 200 feet up the slope, she could see the headlights of the vehicle that had hit her. Were stationary, waiting, making sure. They're watching, she understood. They want to see if anything moves. She put her hand on Ranger's back and pushed him into the tree line. She didn't know how long she walked. Long enough for the cruiser to explode. She heard it more than felt it. A deep concussive thump that rolled through the mountain and set off a brief cascade of snow from the trees above them. And after that, the orange light behind her was gone, and there was only the dark and the storm and her own heartbeat, which was doing erratic and concerning things. Ranger stayed close. He was limping, his left foreleg held slightly off the snow on every third stride, and he made no sound about it, which was somehow worse than if he had. She was up to her knees in snow in some places. Her duty jacket was designed for cold, but not for this, not for submersion in it, and the wet was moving inward through every seam. Her left arm was warming back up in a way that felt ominous, the sharp, invasive heat of something injured demanding attention. She kept the hand tucked against her ribs, against the USB drive. As long as the drive is safe, as long as I keep moving. She was navigating by feel and by the slope of the land, moving downhill, because downhill meant, eventually, reaching the valley floor, and the valley floor meant the highway. And the highway meant someone would find her before she froze. Eventually, probably. She was working on probably. Then she saw the light. It was above her, and to the left, further up the slope, a pale yellow rectangle against the black of the tree line. Someone's window. She stared at it for a long moment, doing the math. Going up instead of down meant elevation and cold and distance. But down was miles, and she wasn't sure she had miles left in her, and Ranger's limp was getting worse sets. She started up toward the light. She found the cabin. Because Ranger found it, he pulled ahead of her, in the last 100 yards, moving through the snow with a certainty that suggested he could smell something she couldn't. And when he stopped at the base of a set of steps and looked back at her, she understood he'd already decided this was the destination. Porch was covered. The steps had been recently cleared. There was only an inch of new accumulation on them, where the surrounding snow was knee-deep. Firewood was stacked under the eave on the left side, properly split and covered. Functional. Somebody lived here seriously. She went up the steps and knocked. She knocked harder. 3 solid raps with her right hand. Cop knock, no apology. Her voice was shot. "Hello, I'm a peace officer. I need assistance. My vehicle was in an accident." The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was around 30, give or take, dark hair, unshaven, wearing a gray thermal shirt and jeans like he'd been awake already, or like he didn't sleep much, one or the other. No. He was holding a flashlight pointed downward, not at her, which she registered distantly as a thing people with training did. He looked at her face first, then at Ranger, so at the gash on her temple, back to her face. His expression didn't do what most people's expressions did when they opened a door at 2 in the morning to find a bleeding cop and a bleeding dog. It didn't go wide with alarm. It went still, assessingly still. "How many in the vehicle?" he asked. Not "Are you okay?" "What happened?" Not "Oh my God." "How many in the vehicle?" "Just me," she said, "and my dog. Anyone follow you up here?" She hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was apparently 1 second too long. "Come inside," he said, and stepped back. Cabin was warm, genuinely, radiantly warm, the kind of wood fire warmth that hits your face first and then moves inward. She stood on the mat inside the door and dripped melting snow onto it and tried to remember how her legs worked. Ranger pressed against her left side. The man he'd said his name was Luke said it the way people said their names when they didn't particularly care if you remembered it, crouched in front of Ranger first. That registered, too. He ran his hands along Ranger's legs and shoulders with practiced efficiency, hesitation, checking the gash above the shoulder, feeling the limping foreleg with 2 fingers. "Soft tissue," he said, "foreleg, not broken. The shoulder cut needs cleaning." He looked up at her. "You need to sit down, I'm fine. You said that walking up my steps too." "Sit down." She sat. There was a chair near the fireplace, and she reached it without embarrassing herself, which she counted as a victory. The fire was big and immediate, and she felt it on her face and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds before she opened them again. Stay awake. Stay with it. Luke was at the kitchen counter with a first aid kit that was not a drugstore first aid kit. It was a military surplus-style kit, the kind with actual trauma supplies, hemostatic gauze, compression wraps, Israeli bandages. He carried it to the coffee table without ceremony and set it down and looked at her arm. "Left arm? Yeah, I need to see it." She unzipped the jacket with her right hand and shrugged the left side off her shoulder, and the movement sent a bright vertical line of pain up through the joint, and she bit down on it. Luke examined the shoulder with the same 2-finger economy he'd used on Ranger, pressing along the deltoid and into the joint itself. "Dislocated," he said. "Anteriorist. I can put it back. Or I can wrap it immobile, and you wait for an ER. How far is the ER? In this storm, 4 hours minimum." She looked at him. "Can you actually do it, or are you just—" "I've done it, in worse conditions with worse equipment." She believed him. Yet, she didn't know anything about him yet, but she believed him. It was not a pleasant 30 seconds. She kept her eyes on the fire and focused on breathing through her nose, and not making sounds that she would later be embarrassed by. And when it was done, the sudden wet pop, the joint sighting thing, the relief was so immediate and total that she exhaled in a way that was almost a sob. "Good," Luke said quietly. "Not there you go. Not all done. Just good, like she'd done something right." He wrapped the shoulder in a compression bandage while she sat there, getting the shaking under control. Then he turned to Ranger and started cleaning the gash with the same methodical care. "You live up here alone?" she asked. "Yes." "How long?" 3 years. She looked around the cabin. It was spare, not empty, but spare. Photographs anywhere. A bookshelf with military history and technical manuals, mostly. Topographic map of the surrounding range pinned to the wall beside the front window, with penciled notations she couldn't read from here. A rifle stood in a rack beside the door. Nothing unusual for Wyoming, but it was a serious rifle, a bolt action with a quality scope. To it, not visible from outside but visible now, a handgun on a wall-mounted bracket, within reach of the door. "What do you do up here?" she asked. "Much. Okay." She looked at the map again, the penciled notations. "You ex-military?" He didn't answer right away. He was tying off the bandage on Ranger's shoulder, and he finished that first. "Was on Blackridge Pass tonight," he said. "That someone didn't want you to take down the mountain." She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. "The guardrail on that curve doesn't just fail," he said. "I heard your engine go over. Then I heard the explosion. That's not a weather accident. Weather accidents don't stay on the roads above the crash site with their lights on for 4 minutes." She felt something cold that had nothing to do with the storm. "You were watching from up here. I saw the glow when I went to check the generator. Went down. By the time I got there, you were in the trees." He paused. "You covered your tracks well enough. Someone without optics wouldn't have followed you. Without optics, he'd had binoculars, or a scope. At 2 in the morning in a blizzard, he'd been scanning the slope." She reached into her vest and placed the USB drive on the coffee table between them. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. 4 months of freight records, she said. Falsified permits, altered patrol schedules, authorization signatures from people who should not be authorizing anything, and a money trail that ends at Mayor Victor Crane's personal holding company. She let that land. "That's what someone didn't want me to take down the mountain." Looked at the drive for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Victor Crane," he said, flat, factual. "You know him? Cedar Hollow's not that big. You know who runs it." He picked up the drive and turned it over once in his fingers, not examining it, just holding it, and set it back down. "You were never supposed to reach another police station." A log shifted in the fireplace. Wind drove snow against the window, along a stained hiss, and somewhere outside, something creaked under the weight of accumulation. "You should have called it in," he said. "To who?" "I didn't know who I could trust." "You still don't." She looked at him. "You don't know who I am," he said. "You walked into a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night. Could have left me in the snow. So could a lot of people before they decided not to." He wasn't threatening her. His voice was completely even, but he wasn't reassuring her either. He was just being accurate. "I'm saying you should think about what you're putting on that table." She held his gaze. "I already put it on the table." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, more like a recalibration. Recognition, maybe, of a particular kind of stubbornness. "Get some sleep," he said, and stood. "I'll keep watch." She started to argue, opened her mouth, had the argument ready, and then the exhaustion hit her like a physical thing, like the cold she'd been running from had caught up and was now cashing in its claim. And she closed her mouth and leaned back in the chair and pulled the blanket he'd laid over the armrest across her lap. Ranger put his head on her knee. She was asleep in under 2 minutes. She woke to darkness. Not the darkness of a room with a fire. The fire was still going, amber light across the ceiling. But something else was different, something structural. Then she understood. The refrigerator wasn't humming. The digital clock on the stove was blank. The ceiling light that had been on over the kitchen was off. The power was gone. She sat up. Ranger raised his head. His ears went forward. Luke was at the front window, standing to one side of it, to the side, in front of it. A specific and deliberate choice, looking out at an angle into the darkness beyond. He was already in his jacket and boots. The handgun from the wall bracket was in his hand, low at his side. "Generator's out," he said, without turning. "Line runs along the east side of the building. I need to check it." "When did the power go?" 3 minutes ago. She was on her feet. Her shoulder screamed. She ignored it. "Generators don't lose power in storms," she said. "This one doesn't." He finally looked at her, and his face in the firelight was completely composed, which was more frightening than if he'd looked scared. The line was cut. The fire popped. The wind outside went briefly higher in pitch, a sound like something crying, and then settled back to its baseline roar. Ranger was off the floor, standing, not toward the door, toward the window on the north wall. His ears were hard forward, and his tail was low and straight. "He hears something outside." "They found us," she said. "They were always going to find us." Luke moved to the rifle rack beside the door without hurry, took the rifle down, worked the bolt once to verify the chamber. The question was always how much time we had. "How much time do we have?" He looked at her. "Not much," he said. Outside, through the howling wind and the driving snow and the 100 yards of dark timber surrounding the cabin, came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. And mechanical, moving, snowmobiles, more than one. The sound wasn't loud. That was the thing about snowmobiles in deep powder. At distance, they didn't roar. They hummed, a low synthetic drone that the storm tried to cover but couldn't quite swallow. Claire stood in the firelight, counting engines, the way you counted heartbeats when something was wrong, trying to separate one from another through the wall and the wind. 2, maybe 3. Luke was already moving, and she watched him and understood. In the way you understand things when adrenaline sharpens the world down to its essential geometry, that he had been ready for this. Ready in the way of hoping it wouldn't happen. Ready in the way of having already decided what to do when it did. He went to the kitchen and pulled a bag from beneath the counter, a go bag, olive drab, already packed, and set it on the table without opening it. Then he went to the topographic map on the wall and pressed 2 fingers against it, at a point southeast of the cabin's position. "There's a service road here," he said. "Forestry. It runs down to the state highway in about 4 miles. If we go now, in the dark, on foot, Ranger can't do 4 miles in this," Claire said. His foreleg. Luke looked at the dog. Ranger was still facing the north wall, still rigid, and the sound from outside was slightly louder now, resolving itself out of the background noise of the storm. "Then we don't go," Luke said. He wasn't frustrated. He said it the way you adjusted a plan, clinical and immediate. "What's the alternative?" "We hold position. Against how many?" "We'll find out." She stared at him. "That's your plan? We'll find out?" "My plan has a few more steps than that." No, he moved to the rifle rack, took down a second firearm, a pump-action shotgun she hadn't noticed before, racked high on the inside wall, and held it out to her. "Can you shoot left-handed?" "I'm right-handed." "I know." "Can you shoot left-handed?" She took the shotgun. It was heavier than she preferred. "Well enough. Good enough is fine." He went to the window. Again. Same position. Same angle. He said, looking out without silhouetting himself against the firelight. "Kill the fire. The fire's our only heat source. And it's up like a target. Kill it." She crossed to the fireplace and used the iron poker to spread the burning logs apart, then laid the fire blanket from the hearth kit over them. The room went dark in stages, the orange glow fading to red to nothing. And then there was only the pale ambient light of the blizzard coming through the windows, that strange blue-gray luminescence of heavy snowfall, and the cold beginning its slow, methodical reclamation of the space. Was a shadow at the window. Ranger made no sound. "How long have you been out here?" Claire said quietly. "She didn't mean tonight, I told you. 3 years. "That's not what I asked." A silence. Outside, the hum of the snowmobiles had shifted. The engines cut one by one in a staggered sequence that meant they were dismounting. "Staging, spreading out. Professionals. 12 years active duty," Luke said. "Last 6 of those." He stopped. "It doesn't matter right now. It matters if it tells me what we're working with." He looked at her across the dark room. She could barely make out his face, just the shape of him, but she caught something in the line of his jaw. Reluctance exactly. More like a door he'd stopped opening for a long time. "We're working with someone who knows how to move in the dark and has patience," he said. "That's enough for right now." She let it go. There was a sound from outside, not an engine, not the wind. Something compressed. A boot on packed snow. Close. Too close. "North side," she said. "Yeah." He moved away from the front window without a word, crossing the room with his footsteps, landing soft, and even going to the north wall, where there was a smaller window above the kitchen sink. He stood beside it, looked. 2, he said. One moving to the east corner, holding at the tree line. The others? South approach. Probably. He came back toward the center of the room. "Boxing us." Claire's jaw tightened. 4 miles in a blizzard with a wounded dog wasn't viable, and they both knew it. Staying put against an unknown number of armed men with a suppressed evidence drive and a dislocated shoulder that was already threatening to re-separate wasn't viable either. She ran the math, and the math came out bad, regardless of which column she put the numbers in. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. "There are about 20 things I'm not telling you. The one I need right now." He crossed to the east wall, where a section of wood paneling ran from floor to ceiling beside the bookshelf. He pressed on it with his palm in a specific spot. A section of it swung inward, not a door, exactly, more like a panel that had been retrofitted to swing, revealing a dark space behind it that smelled of machinery and cold metal. Claire stared. "Utility crawl space," Luke said. "Runs under the east half of the cabin to the exterior wall. There's an exit hatch at the far end that opens under the porch, east side." He'd looked at her. If things go sideways inside, you take Ranger and you go through that and you run for the service road regardless of the snow. 4 miles or 2 miles or however far you get. And you? He didn't answer that. Luke, the drive gets off this mountain, he said. That's what matters. Something moved on the roof. A weight, shifting, one step, then another, measured and careful, directly above them. They both looked up. Ranger finally made a sound low, from deep in his chest, almost below the register of hearing. A bark, a warning. Luke raised the rifle. Claire raised the shotgun and immediately regretted it as her left shoulder announced its opinion of the movement in bright, unambiguous terms. She braced it differently stock against her right shoulder, left hand steadying the forend as a support only, and it was awkward and wrong, but it was workable. The front window exploded inward. Glass. There was no glass. It was all safety glass, and it came apart in a cascade of pebbled fragments that scattered across the floor and the bookshelf and the coffee table, and with the window gone, the wind was immediately, violently inside the cabin, a roaring column of frozen air that hit her like a wall and made the remaining embers in the fireplace flare briefly orange before dying. Claire dropped behind the couch. Not a decision, a reflex, body moving before brain could weigh in. 2 more windows, back of the cabin. The small bedroom window and the bathroom window, both going in quick succession, glass and wind and cold and the sudden, geometrically disorienting awareness that the cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a box with holes in it. The men outside were controlling the airflow, controlling the sight lines, controlling... Return fire yet, Luke said from somewhere to her left. His voice was completely level. He could have been commenting on the weather. I wasn't going to... Some people do. She pressed herself against the back of the couch and breathed and counted. Ranger had come to her, without being called, pressing his body against her right side, and she put her hand on him and felt him trembling, not fear. She'd learned to read the difference. It was the trembling of a dog whose every instinct was screaming at him to act, being held back by the specific discipline of his training, waiting for the command that hadn't come. She told him, low and quiet, "Hold," a voice from outside, organized, carrying authority in its flatness. "Deputy Maddox," a pause. "We're not here for you." She said nothing. "Leave the drive on the porch and walk away. You and the dog. Nobody else needs to get involved in this." Luke made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "They're already in the east tree line," he said, almost inaudible. "That offer's not real." "I know," she whispered back. "I'm going to make some noise on the north side. When I do, move to the utility panel. We're not splitting up. I'm not asking. I'm not going through that crawl space and leaving you, Claire." He said her name for the first time, and it stopped her cold, the specificity of it, the directness. The drive, off the mountain. That's the mission. You understand missions? She did. She hated that she did. 30 seconds, he said. Then he was moving, low and fast, toward the north wall. The voice outside came again. "Last offer, deputy." Luke hit the north window frame from the side and fired twice through the opening, not at anything she could see, angled to force the man at the tree line into cover, to break the pattern of their staging, to make noise on the north side exactly like he said. The gunfire inside the cabin was enormous, filling the small space entirely, and Claire was moving before the echo finished, across the floor on her knees, one hand on the USB drive in her vest, other dragging the shotgun. Ranger flowing alongside her, with his limp barely showing, because adrenaline had apparently overridden his pain assessment entirely. She reached the panel, found the spot, pressed, it swung. Then she stopped, because the sound she heard from the south side of the cabin, a specific sound, heavy and purposeful, was not a man approaching. It was something heavier, the sound of something being tried against the door. Not a knock, not an entry tool, a vehicle. They'd brought a vehicle up on the south side, and they were going to use it against the cabin door. She started. A shape came through the destroyed front window. A man, a canister, gray metal trailing smoke as it cleared the windowsill and hit the floor and began rolling in a lazy arc across the hardwood. Smoke grenade, or something worse. "Go," Luke said from somewhere she couldn't see. "Right now," she went. The crawl space was 40 feet of hell. It was not designed for a human adult. It was designed for pipes and wiring and seasonal maintenance, and it was 18 inches of clearance on a good day and considerably less where the foundation had shifted. Claire moved through it on her elbows with the shotgun, dragging along her right side, and Ranger moving ahead of her with an instinctive low body posture that suggested he'd done worse, though she was fairly sure he hadn't. Cold total. The ground was frozen dirt, and it wicked heat out of her through her uniform jacket and immediately and persistently. Her shoulder was communicating its feelings with every forward push of her left arm, which she was using whether it wanted to participate or not, because the alternative was moving at half speed, and there wasn't time for half speed. She could hear things above her. Movement. At least 2 sets of footsteps crossing the cabin floor. A voice, a different voice. The one from outside. Someone inside already giving short, clipped instructions she couldn't fully parse through the floor joists. She caught fragments, clear, negative, tactical radio chatter. Crawling slowed involuntarily as her brain processed this. They had comms. They were coordinating room by room. They were moving through the cabin with a sweep pattern. Where was Luke? She didn't know. She kept moving. The exit hatch was a plywood square set into the floor of the crawl space at the far end, secured with a single draw bolt that she found by touch in the absolute dark. She drew it back, pushed, and the hatch opened outward into the space beneath the porch, and the cold air that hit her was even colder than the crawl space, which she would not have believed possible 60 seconds ago. She came out from under the porch edge into 8 inches of blowing snow, Ranger immediately beside her. Above her, through the porch boards, she could hear boots. Someone was standing on the porch directly overhead, waiting. She pressed herself flat against the foundation and did not breathe. 30 seconds. The boots on the porch shifted once, then went still. The man above her was facing the yard, watching the approach. He hadn't looked down. Claire looked at the tree line. 20 feet of open snow, then dark timber. 20 feet was not far. 20 feet in a blizzard, against a man with a weapon who was looking the other way, was manageable. Without Ranger, she might have tried it already. But Ranger moving through deep snow at speed made noise. The dog knew it too. He was watching her with complete attention, waiting, letting her make the call. She looked back at the cabin. Through the gap where the front window had been, she could see the interior, the smoked canister, due to thick chemical haze that was pouring out through the openings and being torn apart by the wind, and she could see a light moving through it. Tactical flashlight. Someone sweeping the front room. Then another light. From the east side. Another figure coming around the corner of the cabin, not a sweep figure. Someone moving with purpose toward the porch. And he was going to come up the porch steps in about 8 seconds, and he was going to find the man already standing there, and then one of them was going to look down. She tapped Ranger on the shoulder. Their signal. Now. Fast. He went. She went. The snow was deep and wrong, and her boots punched through the crust with every stride, and she felt the exposure of it. The open ground. The seconds ticking between her back and whatever was behind her, and she ran anyway. Fast. Nothing in this snow was fast, but continuously, without stopping, leaning forward into the wind that was doing its best to push her back. She hit the tree line. She pressed herself against the first trunk and turned and looked back. Porch, both figures there. Now, one pointing down at the hatch, the disturbed snow beneath the porch, and then they were both looking at the tree line, looking directly at her position. She pulled herself deeper into the timber and kept moving. The service road was not 4 miles. This was the first thing she established once the trees closed around her, and she had enough of her bearings to use the slope and the drainage patterns to navigate. The service road was closer to 2.5 miles if she cut the switchback on the upper approach, which she could do on foot in snow in a way that a vehicle couldn't. This was what she was telling herself. She needed to be telling herself something that wasn't Luke is back there alone with multiple armed men. Ranger moved ahead of her, through the timber, his body a dark shape, against the slightly lighter dark of the snow, his limp present but not stopping him, and she followed him because dogs navigated by smell, and right now her visibility was 20 feet in any direction, and smell was considerably more useful than vision. She had the USB drive. She had the shotgun with 4 rounds remaining because she'd counted. She had her service weapon with a full magazine and one in the chamber. She had a dislocated shoulder that had been relocated an hour ago and was now seriously reconsidering the decision. She had a mild concussion from the crash possibly, which would explain why the trees seemed to tilt slightly when she moved too fast. She did not have a radio. She hadn't had it since the cruiser went off the road, because the radio had been mounted in the dash, and the dash was now debris on the slope below Blackridge Pass. She stopped. There was a creak somewhere below her. She could hear it, or she thought she could, a low ongoing sound beneath the wind that was either water over stones or just another variation of the storm. She used it to anchor her position on the mental map she was building. The service road would cross the creek on a culvert, maybe 8 feet of pipe under 2 feet of gravel, simple forestry infrastructure. Concrete. If she found the creek, she could follow it down to the culvert, and the culvert would put her on the road. She started toward the sound. She was 20 feet into the descent when Ranger stopped. Slow stop. An immediate stop, weight shifted back, body lowering. He turned his head to the right. Somewhere to the right, in the dark timber, something moved. Claire raised the shotgun. Her left arm screamed. She held the position anyway. Wind, snow, the creak of timber under ice weight. A voice from roughly 10 feet away in the dark. Shoot, Luke. She lowered the shotgun, and the relief that moved through her was physical and embarrassing in its intensity. She pressed it down immediately. He came out of the dark between 2 pines, moving with a controlled limp. She hadn't seen before something with his right knee that he was managing rather than favoring. A very specific kind of management. And he was carrying his rifle and the go bag, and he had a cut above his right ear that had bled down the side of his face and dried into a dark streak. She started. East crawlspace exit isn't the only modification I made to that cabin, he said. She stared at him. You have a second exit. I have 3. I built the crawlspace 1-2 years ago. There's also a root cellar hatch in the back bedroom floor and a collapse point in the north wall that looks like settling but isn't. He said this completely without self-congratulation, which somehow made it stranger. I've been in that cabin for 3 years. I had time. You built 3 escape routes into your cabin. I built 4, but the 4th one has structural issues I never resolved. What to do with the information, so she filed it for later. The men inside, she said, 5 total. 4 came in, 1 stayed on perimeter. The 4 who came in were wearing plate carriers and running comms on what looked like encrypted handhelds. Local talent. He glanced at her. Crane brought in outside contractors. Mercenaries. Contractors. There's a spectrum. He looked back the way she'd come, scanning the timber with an automatic quality, like his eyes were doing it while his brain processed something else. They cleared the cabin in about 90 seconds. Clean pattern. 2-man teams, leapfrog. These guys are not amateurs. Can we still reach the service road? We need to change the route. Someone on the road. By now, it's the obvious extraction path, and if team leader is worth anything, he's already covered it. So what's the alternative? Luke reached into the front pocket of the go bag and produced something small. Black. She almost didn't recognize it at first. A radio. Military spec, compact. The kind that ran on encrypted frequencies rather than the open consumer bands. Extended the antenna. I have a contact, he said. She blinked. A contact. Someone I can reach on this frequency. Someone outside Crane's reach. Who? He looked at her. That door again, the one he'd stopped opening. But this time he didn't close it all the way. Someone I used to work with, he said, before the cabin. She wanted more than that. She could see, he knew she wanted more than that. And she could see he was making a deliberate choice about how much of the distance between them to close. And she could also see, heat in the dark of the timber, with the storm driving snow sideways between the trees, that this was not the moment to push it. Okay, she said. He keyed the radio. What came out of it surprised her. Words, a tone sequence. 3 tones. Pause. 2 tones. Pause. 1 tone. Pattern. This prearranged, clearly, because he hadn't hesitated before keying it, and he knew exactly what keys to press, without looking at the unit. He waited. Static, wind interference and static. 20 seconds of it. 3 tones back, then 2, then 1. Luke exhaled 1 short, controlled exhale that was the most expressive thing she'd seen him do. 6 hours, he said, minimum. For what response? Anyone I can trust to show up at these coordinates is going to need 6 hours minimum to get here in this storm. He looked at the sky reflexive, checking, the kind of habit you never lose, and then at the timber around them. We need to stay off the road and off the open ridgeline for 6 hours. Blizzard, at elevation, with a wounded dog. Yes, while a team of professional contractors is looking for us. Yes, Zell. She let the full weight of this settle for exactly the amount of time it needed to settle, which was about 2 seconds, and then she straightened up and adjusted the shotgun across her shoulder. "What do you need me to do?" she said. Something moved across his face. Relief, not approval, something quieter than both of those. "Follow me," he said. "Don't use your light. Step where I step." He looked at Ranger. "He okay for distance?" As if in answer, Ranger moved to Luke's left side and looked up at him. Luke looked at the dog for a moment. Then he turned and started moving through the timber, and Claire followed. And Ranger moved between them in the dark, his breath a small white cloud in the frozen air, his shoulder bleeding through the bandage in a thin dark line he didn't acknowledge. Above the tree line, somewhere on the mountain road, headlights were moving, searching. Below in the dark timber, 3 figures moved south through the snow and disappeared. The headlights on the mountain roads swept through the timber in slow arcs, methodical and patient, the way a search pattern looks when the people running it aren't in a hurry because they believe they have all the advantages. Luke watched them from between 2 spruce trees and counted the intervals. 12 seconds between sweeps. 1 vehicle, stationary on the access road above, rotating a mounted spotlight in a standard coverage pattern, which meant whoever was driving that vehicle was not moving, was not searching on foot, was providing overwatch for the people on foot below, which meant there was a team leader who understood force distribution. He filed this and kept moving. The going was slow, in a way that had nothing to do with the snow, though the snow was bad enough. It was the silence protocol that slowed them. No flashlights, voices above a murmur, step selection based on what you could see in the ambient glow of the storm, which was not much. Moved in short intervals, stopped, listened, moved again. Claire followed his pattern without being told to, which told him something about her. People who didn't have discipline argued with the intervals. They got impatient. They closed the gap too fast, or they lagged and then rushed to catch up and made noise doing it. She didn't do any of those things. Ranger moved between them, with the effortless silence of an understood on some level deeper than training. That sound was dangerous tonight. His shoulder was still bleeding. Luke had checked it twice during stops, and the bandage was saturated on the outer layer, but holding. The wound wasn't deep enough to be immediately critical, but it was persistent in the way that soft tissue injuries were persistent in cold, where the blood stayed thin and refused to clot properly. He needed warmth and rest, and neither of those things was available. Luke knew the terrain from 3 years of walking it in every season and every weather condition, which was the only reason they were moving at all. He deliberately learned this mountain the way he'd been taught to learn operational areas, not casually, not recreationally, with the specific intent of knowing every drainage and every ridgeline and every spot where the ground did something unexpected. He'd hiked it in summer to understand in the topography, and then hiked it again in winter to understand what the topography became under snow. Because those were 2 different landscapes, and only one of them was the one that mattered when things went wrong. Things had gone wrong. The secondary shelter was 2 miles south, and roughly 400 feet lower in elevation, a natural depression in the rock face that he'd reinforced over 2 winters with timber framing and a corrugated metal roof covered in accumulated debris. From the air it looked like deadfall. From the ground it was invisible until you were within 15 feet of the entrance. He'd never told anyone about it. He'd never had a reason to. He had a reason now. He stopped at a boulder outcrop and pressed himself against the rock and held up his fist. Claire stopped. Ranger stopped. Voices, upslope and to the east. 2 of them, running a conversation in the abbreviated way of people on comms, who are also physically moving clipped, functional, status reports rather than sentences. Luke pressed his ear toward the sound and parsed what he could through the wind. Negative contact south quadrant. Moving to copy. Hold at the drainage. I'm Halloran. You have eyes on the road. The third voice came from somewhere different. Higher. The man on overwatch. Which meant they were using the vehicle radio as a relay. Which meant their handheld comms had limited range in these terrain conditions, and they were compensating with the truck as a repeater. It also meant he had 3 of the 5 positions now. Overwatch on the road above, 2-man element east of him at roughly 200 yards. That left 2 unaccounted for, and unaccounted for in this context was not a comfortable thing to sit with. He turned to Claire, leaned in close enough that he could speak at a volume that didn't carry. East, 2 men, moving to the drainage which is about 150 yards behind us. He watched her process this. They're going to cut across our back trail. She looked at him. In the dark, her face was reduced to shapes the line of her jaw, the dark of her eyes. Can they track us in this snow? In daylight with the storm stopped, yes. Right now, he glanced up. The snow was still coming hard. We've got maybe 20 minutes before our tracks are filled enough to be ambiguous. But if they're good, they'll follow the depression pattern in the snow rather than the tracks themselves. Are they good? He thought about the 90-second cabin clear. Coordinated staging, the encrypted comms. Yes, he said. She didn't flinch. He'd noticed she didn't flinch at the bad news, which was rarer than people assumed. Most people, when you gave them the unvarnished version, found a way to argue with it or tried to find the silver lining before they'd actually absorbed the information. Claire just took it in and moved to the next question. New route, she said. We go lower. There's a dry creek bed about 300 yards west. Running it means we leave no surface tracks. Running a creek bed in a blizzard. Been dry since August. It's just rock and gravel under the snow. Just rock and gravel, she repeated, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. And it takes us where? To the secondary position. She waited. I have another shelter, he said. A pause. You have another shelter. I'll explain it when we're inside it. He could feel her deciding whether to push this, and he could feel the moment she decided not to. Lead, she said. The creek bed was exactly what he'd described, and exactly as unpleasant as she'd expected. The snow filled it to ankle depth, and beneath the snow to ankle depth, and beneath the snow was ice-glazed rock, and beneath that was gravel that shifted under load, and the whole thing required constant weight adjustment to navigate without going down. Claire went down twice. The first time she caught herself on the rifle, which she was going to have words with her shoulder. And the second time she simply fell, left knee on rock. And the pain was immediate and specific, and she got up without making a sound because making a sound was not an option. Luke heard it anyway. He turned and came back 2 steps and looked at her. I'm fine, she said. He looked at her knee, back at her face. I'm fine, she said again. He turned and kept moving. Ranger navigated the creek bed with a canine pragmatism that she found briefly infuriating, forelegs as being a particular advantage in this particular situation, and she followed the dark shape of him and put her feet where his paws had compressed. The snow, because that at least told her the surface would hold. The voices from upslope had faded. Either the 2 men had changed direction, or the storm was absorbing the sound more effectively at this elevation. Luke didn't seem to find either possibility. Reassuring, he moved with the same controlled urgency he'd maintained since the cabin, never faster than the terrain allowed, never slower than the situation required. Pace that was calculated rather than emotional, and that she was having increasing difficulty maintaining on a knee that was swelling against the inside of her boot. She didn't tell him about the knee. The secondary shelter appeared out of the dark, the way he'd said it would, invisible until she was nearly on top of it. A dark gap in the rock face that her brain initially registered as shadow, before resolving into an entrance, roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, framed in rough timber that had weathered to the same gray-brown as the surrounding stone. Luke held at the entrance for a moment, scanning the surrounding terrain, then went in. Ranger followed. Claire bent and went through and straightened into a space that was larger than the entrance suggested, maybe 8 feet by 12. The ceiling high enough to stand in the center. The walls tight enough that the timber frame and the rock and whatever insulation he'd packed into the gaps had retained some heat. Much heat, but some. Luke was moving around the interior with the casual efficiency of someone navigating a familiar space in the dark, which he was. She heard the scrape of a match, not a lighter, a match, and then a small flame appeared and was applied to a can stub in a tin holder that he'd set on a flat rock. The light was minimal. It was enough. The shelter had a sleeping pad rolled against the far wall. Cache of supplies in a waterproof box. She could see MRE packaging and a water filter and what looked like medical supplies. A second radio on a charging cradle connected to a small battery bank. A hand-drawn topographic sketch tacked to the timber framing on the right wall. Paracord stretched between the walls at chest height, with a space blanket folded over it. She looked at all of this. She looked at him. How long did it take you to build this? She said. Parts of 2 winters. Why? He was already opening the medical supply cache. He found a Kindwind. He found a compression bandage and brought it to where Ranger had settled on the sleeping pad. The dog had found it immediately, with the instinct animals had for warm, soft surfaces, and started removing the saturated bandage from the shoulder wound. "Why does anyone build a second exit?" he said. "Because they expect to need it. Because they plan for needing it." He worked the wound clean with an antiseptic wipe, his movements precise in the candlelight. Planning and expecting aren't the same thing. He sat down on the supply box because standing was becoming a decision that required conscious effort, and she had other things to spend conscious effort on. "Someone taught you to plan like this?" "Yes, for 6 years." He paused for just a fraction of a second, then kept working. She'd used his own words back at him. He recognized it. "Something like that," he said. Ranger made a sound low, involuntary, the sound of an animal experiencing pain and trying not to, and Luke's hand stopped moving, and he waited until the dog's muscles relaxed before continuing. She watched the patience in it, the way he waited for the dog rather than working through the dog's tension. "You've done this before," she said, "with animals." "Working dogs," he said, "military. We had canine units attached on some deployments." He secured the new bandage and sat back. "He's tough. The bleeding's slower. I know he's tough." Luke looked at her then, fully, and she realized the candle was behind her, and he could probably see her see if it was better than she could see his. "Knee," he said. "It's fine. You're not putting weight on your left leg. I'm sitting down. You shifted your weight when you sat. Right side. And your boot's laced wrong on the left foot. You loosened it." He looked at her steadily. "When did you go down?" She had a moment of pure irritation, the specific irritation of being accurately observed when you didn't want to be. "Creek bed," she said. "I'm fine. Take the boot off. We may need to move fast." "You're not moving fast on a knee you can't bend." "Take it off." She took the boot off. The knee was not fine. It was swollen at the medial side and already darkening, and when he ran his thumb along the joint line, she pulled back sharply, which told both of them what they needed to know. "MCL," he said. "Mild to moderate. You can walk on it. Running is going to be a problem." Running was already a problem in knee-deep snow. "Fair." He wrapped it with an elastic bandage from the cache, not tight enough to restrict circulation, enough to provide some support and remind her proprioceptively where the joint was. It helped more than she expected. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and sat back, and they were quiet for a moment, the two of them and the dog in the small with the candle between them and the storm doing its work outside, filling in the creek bed and covering the shelter entrance and gradually erasing the evidence of their passage. She looked at the second radio on the charging cradle. "Is that operational?" "Range limited. Good for about 5 miles in these conditions." He checked his watch. 4 hours and 40 minutes until the response window. They'll have aircraft. If they can get one airborne in this weather, yes. What if they can't? Then it's ground vehicles on the state highway, and we meet them at the road. She did the math on what meeting them at the road looked like with a blown knee and a wounded dog and an unknown number of contractors between here and there, and she set the math aside because it wasn't useful right now. "Tell me about Crane," Luke said. She looked at him. "We've got time," he said. "Tell me about him." So she told him. She started where she always started when she explained it to herself on the long, quiet drives she'd been taking for 4 months, talking to Ranger in the back, because she needed to say it out loud to hear if it held together. The freight routes on Blackridge Pass had been wrong for almost 2 years before she noticed, and she'd only noticed because she'd written a speeding ticket to a Crane transport driver in March, and the manifest on his truck hadn't matched the weigh station record on file. And instead of calling the number on the manifest like she was supposed to, she'd run the truck through her own records and found that the same vehicle number had cleared the Blackridge Pass checkpoint 4 times in the previous 6 weeks on nights. When the checkpoint was staffed by a single deputy, always the same deputy, who had approved all 4 loads in under 3 minutes each. 3 minutes for a full freight inspection was not possible. 3 minutes for a full freight inspection that produced paperwork clean enough to clear the state records meant someone was stamping without looking, which meant someone was being paid to stamp without looking, which meant the question was not whether something illegal was moving through Blackridge Pass, but what it was and who knew about it. She'd been careful. She hadn't used department resources after the first 2 weeks because she realized the risk and switched to personal time and personal methods which had been expensive and slow but had produced records that couldn't be accessed by anyone else through the department system. No. She'd spent 3 weekends going through municipal contract records at the county annex in Ridgewood, cross-referencing crane transport's permit applications against the authorization signatures. The authorization and the authorization signatures had led her in a direction she hadn't expected. Just permits, not just a bribed checkpoint deputy. Victor Crane's holding company, a real estate and logistics entity called Blackridge Consolidated, incorporated in a state with minimal disclosure requirements, appeared as a co-signatory on 17 separate municipal infrastructure contracts over the past 4 years. Road maintenance, communications tower access, bridge inspection scheduling. 17 contracts that between them gave Crane's people legitimate, documented reason to be on every major route through the county at almost any time, with vehicles that could carry almost anything, with paperwork that would survive a routine stop. The USB drive had all of it. Contracts, the permit records, the checkpoint logs, the financial routing documents she'd photographed at the annex on her 3rd visit. The visit where she'd noticed the camera in the hallway had been pointed at the wall was 3 weeks ago. The camera pointed at the wall was when she'd understood. This was not a county-level problem. Luke listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked one question at the end. Checkpoint deputy, the one who was stamping. Deputy Dennis Terrace, where is he now? Medical leave since April. Stress-related. Luke was quiet for a moment. Or he said something that scared someone. Or that, she said. Outside the storm intensified briefly, a gust that drove snow against the rock face above the entrance with the sound like thrown gravel, and then eased back. In the shelter, the candle flame moved and settled. The 17 contracts, Luke said. What was moving? Specifically, the manifest records don't show it. They show generic categories, construction materials, agricultural equipment. But the weight records and the load times don't match the manifest categories. Some of these loads were too heavy for what they claimed to be carrying. Some were too fast at loading terminals that should have taken hours. She paused. I have a theory, tell me. I think some of it was equipment. Moving equipment and components through the counties disguised as standard freight for facilities that don't appear on any business license database I could access. She looked at him. Couldn't prove the destination. That's the piece that's missing. The drive has everything up to that gap. Luke stared at the candle for a moment. His jaw moved, slightly, the way people's jaws moved when they were working through something they weren't. That's enough, he said. What's on the drive is enough for a federal inquiry. The destination. He stopped. What? The destination would come out in the inquiry. You sound like you know what it is. He looked at her directly. I don't know what it is, but I know what that pattern looks like. Weight discrepancies on nighttime loads through routes with paid-off checkpoints, moving to locations that don't file standard business registrations. He held her gaze. That's not a tax evasion operation. She'd known that. She'd known it for 3 weeks and had been keeping it at a distance because knowing it made the whole thing larger than a county deputy running an unauthorized investigation had any business being involved in. She said, it's not. The second radio crackled. Words, a tone, single tone, sustained, two seconds, and silence. Luke was on his feet before the tone finished. What is that? Claire said. Proximity alert. He moved to the entrance, blew out the candle, and the dark was absolute. Motion sensor. I have 3 of them. Staggered approach from the north. They found us? Not yet. The sensor's at 150 yards. He was at the entrance now, looking out through the narrow gap. Could be an animal. Could be wind on a branch. A pause. Could be a man who's very good at moving quietly. Claire got her boot on. The knee protested. She got to her feet, and her hand found the shotgun in the dark by muscle memory. What are we doing? She said, waiting. For what? For the second sensor. The second sensor did not activate. A minute passed. 2 minutes. Luke stayed at the entrance without moving, and she stayed behind him and controlled her breathing and listened to the storm and thought about the 17 contracts and the weight discrepancies and the checkpoint deputy who'd gone on medical leave in April. 3 minutes. Animal, Luke said quietly. She exhaled. Then her knee went out. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a sudden failure of load-bearing that dropped her left side before she caught herself on the timber frame. And the sound she made was involuntary and small, but in the absolute silence of the shelter, after the radio tone it was loud enough. turned. Sit, he said. Sit down, Claire. She sat. He came back inside, and she couldn't see his face in the dark, but she could hear him moving to her position. And then he was crouching in front of her, and his hands found her knee by feel, and she realized he'd moved directly to it in complete darkness, no hesitation, which meant he'd memorized her position from before the candle went out. Can you walk, he said. When I need to, yes. That's not the same as yes. She felt him retighten the bandage. His hands were steady in a way that was different from a doctor's steadiness. A doctor was steady because of training and repetition. This was steady because whatever was happening right now wasn't close to the worst thing his hands had been asked to be steady, to be through. 3 hours and 50 minutes, he said. He was answering a question she hadn't asked. I heard you the first time. You're going to stay off it until we move. I'm not going to argue with you about my own. Good, he stood. Because there's something you need to understand. His voice had changed. Not harder, more deliberate. The way someone's voice changed when they were saying the actual version of something they'd been approximating for a while. When response gets here, he said, and when this goes federal, and it will go federal, what's on that drive is going to make that happen. There are going to be people who ask questions about how you gathered it, about the chain of custody, about what you had authorization to access and what you didn't. You ran an unauthorized investigation for 4 months, using personal time and personal methods. Luke, the defense for everyone on that drive is going to center on that. Every attorney in that case is going to try to throw the evidence based on how it was collected. She looked up at him in the dark. Are you telling me this to be helpful, or are you telling me this because you think I didn't know? Silence. I've known it for 3 months, she said. The chain of custody is complicated. I know there are things on that drive that I accessed in ways that a federal prosecutor is going to have to work around. All of that. Her voice stayed level. I still went to Ridgewood. I still copied those documents. I still got in my cruiser tonight. Silence longer. Yeah, he said. I know. Then why are you telling me? Because I wanted to hear you say it. He moved back to the entrance. People who know the risk and go anyway, that's a different thing from people who don't understand what they're walking into. She sat in the dark with that for a moment. What kind of thing is it? She said. He didn't answer right away. She heard him settle against the entrance frame, his weight shifting to his left side, away from the right knee, she noticed. The knee he'd been managing in the timber, the one he thought she hadn't noticed. A harder thing, he said finally. That's all. Outside, the storm began very gradually, with the reluctance of a Wyoming blizzard acknowledging defeat to ease. The wind dropped in register. The sound of it against the rock face above them went from a roar to a sustained howl to something lower. The snow was still falling, but the lateral violence of it was softening. Luke noticed it before she did. Storm's breaking, he said. Was nothing in his voice to indicate whether this was good or bad. No. She understood why when he said the next thing. When it breaks, they'll have better visibility. And we'll have better visibility. He looked out at the night. Their numbers are better than ours. You said 5. I said 5 that I counted. He turned. Crane sent contractors because he needed results tonight. Results tonight suggests he knew about the evidence, what was on the drive, and why it mattered. He looked at her. Someone told him you were leaving Ridgewood with it. She felt that land in a very specific place. Someone in the department, she said, or in the annex, or in the county records office, or someone who'd been watching you for longer than tonight. He paused. You said you noticed a camera pointed at the wall 3 weeks ago. So someone's known about you for at least 3 weeks, which means Crane has had 3 weeks to prepare. He let that settle. 5 contractors on short notice is probably not his full resource. She looked at him. How many more? I don't know. He said it simply, without apology for not knowing. But I think the reason he sent these 5 tonight, rather than waiting, is that tonight was his best chance. Location in Manchession. Clean scene fire destroys evidence. Storm covers tracks. Witnesses. Except you. I wasn't a known variable until you knocked on my door. She held his gaze in the dark. Are you saying that's a problem? I'm saying Crane now has a problem he didn't plan for. And men like Crane don't respond to unplanned problems by doing less. He picked up the encrypted radio from the cradle, which is why response needs to be on that highway in under 4 hours. He keyed the radio. Not the tone sequence, this time words. Actual, this is Mercer, requesting update on ETA. Conditions have changed. Static. Wind interference. A voice came back, thin, with distance, but clear enough. Mercer copy, revised to 3 hours 15. We have a bird. A pause. Is the principal secure? Looked at Claire. Principal is secure, he said into the radio. Evidence is intact. We have 2 wounded ambulatory. Z will need to be a flat surface, minimum 40 meters. I'll designate on approach. Maintain position. Out. The radio went quiet. Claire stared at him. A bird. They're putting a helicopter in the air. I told you I had a contact. Who are you? She said. Accusatory, genuinely asking. He set the radio down. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which had become a familiar enough pattern between them that she'd started reading the duration of his silences as a kind of answer in itself. Luke Mercer, he said. That's a real name. I didn't change it. But the last 6 years of 12, I wasn't Navy in any way that appears in the regular record. He looked at the topographic sketch on the wall as though he were checking something on it, though she suspected he wasn't. I did things for people in positions to ask for them, in places that don't make official reports, with people who he started again. When it was over, I came up here because I needed somewhere that wasn't any of that. She waited. I'm not going to tell you more than that right now, he said. Not because I don't trust you. I know, she said. And she did. She knew the difference between not trusting and not being ready, and she knew which one it was. Ranger lifted his head from the sleeping pad. His ears went forward. To the north, not to any of the approach angles they'd been watching. Straight up. Luke heard it 2 seconds after the dog did. A snowmobile close, coming from the west, which was the one quadrant he hadn't covered with a sensor, because the western approach was the steepest, and he'd assumed it was non-viable in a winter storm. He'd assumed wrong. Up, he said quietly. Right now. Claire was up before the word was out, bad knee and all, the shotgun in her hands and Ranger already at her side, with his body pressed against her left leg, the way he pressed when he wanted her to move. Luke was at the entrance with the rifle. The snowmobile sound peaked and then stopped. 30 yards, maybe less. An engine doesn't stop like that unless the driver can see what they're looking for. Someone had found the shelter. Luke set the rifle barrel across the entrance frame and looked through the scope, his right eye finding the eyepiece with the automatic precision of 10,000 repetitions, and the crosshairs settled on a dark shape 40 yards out against the tree line, a figure dismounting a snowmobile in the snow. One, Luke said quietly. Claire pressed herself to the right side of the entrance and looked out over his shoulder. The figure was male, plate carrier, weapon up in a low ready position, moving toward them through the snow, with the careful weight shift of someone who suspected they were close to a contact, but hadn't confirmed it yet. He'd found the shelter, but he hadn't confirmed the entrance. Yet, Luke's breathing slowed. She could see it in the minimal rise and fall of his back one breath. The next, the deliberate deceleration of a man doing something he had done many times, something his body knew how to do independently of whatever he might be thinking or feeling about it. She looked at the shotgun in her hands. 4 rounds. Effective range in the dark at 40 yards, maybe 30. When I fire, Luke said, so quietly it was nearly not speech, you cover left. There may be a second one. How do you know? They don't send one. The figure outside moved left, circling toward the entrance angle. 5 seconds and he'd have sightline. Luke, she said. I know, he said again. And then Ranger moved. A launch, not the explosive forward drive of a dog making contact. He stepped out of the entrance, simply walked out, past Luke's legs, into the open snow in front of the shelter and sat down and looked at the approaching figure. Claire's heart stopped. The figure stopped. For 3 seconds, nothing moved except the snow. Luke leaned out and put the rifle on the man and said, voice that carried clearly through the broken storm, absolutely flat and absolutely certain, don't. The man didn't move, not forward, not back. He stood in the snow with his weapon at low ready, and his eyes on the rifle barrel, pointing at him from the shelter entrance, and he made the kind of calculation that men in his profession made quickly and without sentiment, which was whether the person on the other end of that barrel would actually pull the trigger, or whether this was a bluff built on desperation. He decided wrong. He started to raise the weapon. Luke fired once. The shot took the man in the upper right shoulder and spun him left and dropped him into the snow. A kill shot. Claire registered this, the deliberate angle of it, the placement, the fact that Luke had a clean headshot at 40 yards in moderate visibility and didn't take it. The man went down hard, and his weapon went with him, and he made a sound that carried clearly through the quieter storm, a short, compressed sound of pain. Luke was already moving out of the entrance. "Cover the west tree line," he said without looking back. Left of the snowmobile. Claire came out into the cold and took the left angle with the shotgun, and her eyes went to the dark tree line beyond the snowmobile, and she stayed there, scanning, while Luke crossed the open ground to the downed man, in a route that kept him out of her line of fire the entire way. She noticed that, too. He'd angled left before stepping into the open, putting himself on her right, so that if she needed to shoot past him, she had the lane. He reached the man and kicked the weapon away, and crouched and did something she couldn't see from her position. And then he stood and came back. He said, "He was the one." "You're sure?" "He's sure." He held up the man's radio handset. He reported in before he moved on us, told his team he had a possible position, and was investigating independently. He looked at her. "They won't be expecting a check-in for another 8 minutes. What do we do with 8 minutes? We move, right now. Pressure bandage, shoulder, wound. He's not going anywhere in that snow." Luke was already going back into the shelter, coming out with the go bag and the radio cradle. He has a radio. When 8 minutes is up, he can call for help himself. She looked toward the tree line, then at the shelter entrance, at Luke. "We're not taking the snowmobile," she said. "It's loud and it leaves a trail, and it requires a route that they can predict." He looked at her knee. "It's also not designed for 3 passengers. Ranger was already at Luke's left side, looking up at him. "South," Luke said. 20 minutes. The ridgeline opens onto a service flat. It's used as a fire observation platform in summer. Roughly 60 meters of clear, flat surface. He looked at the sky. Storm had broken enough that the lowest clouds had thinned, showing a pale suggestion of lighter sky above. "That's the LZ. How far out is the bird?" He checked his watch. 90 minutes, give or take. We have to hold the LZ for 90 minutes. Approximately. She looked at her knee, at Ranger, the dark mountain around them. "Okay," she said. They moved. The service flat was exactly what he'd described, and not much more a scarred rectangle of compressed gravel and flattened earth at the south end of the ridgeline, where the Forestry Service had historically staged water drops during fire season. It was exposed on 3 sides to open mountain, which was bad for cover and good for sightlines. The north end, where the ridgeline continued, was the only covered approach, which meant it was the only approach worth defending. Luke set Claire and Ranger at the south edge of the flat, behind a low timber survey post that was the only structure on the platform, and went back to the north end to watch the ridgeline. The 90 minutes did not pass quietly. At the 40-minute mark, one of the contractors came up the ridgeline from the east side, off route, moving through rock rather than timber. Someone who'd figured out the timber approaches were covered and had chosen the harder path specifically because it was less predictable. Luke saw him at 80 yards and tracked him for 3 minutes before the man stopped and held his position, which meant he'd seen or heard something, that he wasn't alone on this ridgeline. They stayed like that. Man and rifle, separated by 80 yards of dark rock and wind, neither moving, neither withdrawing. Stalemate that lasted 11 minutes and ended when the man's radio apparently told him something that caused him to change position. He moved back down the east face rather than continuing forward, and Luke let him go. He came back to Claire's position and told her. "He got a recall," she said. "Or he got a warning." Luke crouched beside the survey post, facing north, keeping the ridgeline visible. "Their team leader is good. He's already figured out that we called for response. He's trying to decide whether to push the objective or pull his people." "What would you do?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything, not quickly, with the actual weight of the question. "Pull," he said. "The risk calculation changes the moment you know a response is inbound. You can't destroy the evidence if you can't reach it. And you can't reach it if you get interdicted on approach. Better to withdraw and let Crane's legal team work the problem from the outside than to have 6 contractors detained at an active federal interdiction site. So they might already be pulling back, some of them." He looked at the ridgeline. Some of them might not have gotten the memo. The distinction proved relevant at the 55-minute mark. 2-man element came up the north ridgeline in a bound and cover pattern, one moving while the other held, alternating. He's closing the distance in stages, which was how you approached a defended position when you didn't know exactly where the defense was. They were good. They came up on the eastern edge of the ridgeline path, where the rock provided partial cover, and they moved low and they moved carefully, and they were within 50 yards before Luke had a shot that wasn't partly obscured by the ridge geometry. He let the forward man get to 45 yards before he fired. He missed. She heard him exhale short, and he worked the bolt and fired again. And this time the forward man went down into a crouch, hit but forced into cover, and the second man reversed immediately, backward. Both of them were behind rock, and the situation had turned into something considerably less clean than it had been 15 seconds earlier. Claire had moved left on her own initiative, away from the survey post, getting an angle on the eastern edge that was different from Luke's position at the center. She watched the rock the second man had gone behind, and she saw his boot, just the edge of his boot, extending past the rock on the left side, and she tracked it and waited. The boot moved right. He was shifting position, going for a better angle on Luke. She fired. The shot threw sparks off the rock 2 feet above the boot, and the boot disappeared. And she heard the second man shout something involuntary, startled. And then there was movement on the ridgeline, both men moving back, forward, retreating down the north face, and the sound of them diminished quickly. Luke looked at her from across the flat. He said nothing, but he looked at her for a long moment in a way that wasn't surprise and wasn't assessment. Something past both of those. 2 rounds left, she told him. She looked at the ridgeline. The miss, he said again. 60 yards in the dark, with a rifle you hadn't zeroed. I've had that rifle for 2 years. I've zeroed it. He worked his jaw slightly. Pulled the shot. She waited. It happens, he said. And then, with the specific difficulty of a man who was not accustomed to saying this kind of thing to another person, Simpson. It's been a while since I shot at something that moved. She understood what that cost him to say. She didn't make anything of it. They're pulling back, she said instead. Yeah, for now. For now. They held the LZ for the remaining 35 minutes without contact. Storm continued to ease, the wind dropping by increments, the snow thinning from a sustained fall to intermittent flurries. Temperature dropped as the cloud cover broke, which was how mountain weather worked. The storm kept you relatively insulated while it ran, and when it ended, it left you exposed to the actual cold beneath, which was considerable. Claire sat with her back against the survey post and her bad knee extended, and Ranger pressed against her right side. And she watched the North Ridgeline and thought about Dennis Terrace on medical leave since April, and the camera pointed at the wall, and the 17 contracts, and Victor Crane's face on the county website, the official photograph. Careful smile of a man who'd spent years ensuring that people saw exactly what he wanted them to see. She thought about the 2 times she'd applied for detective. The first review board had told her she needed more time in field before she'd have the case-built Colting's experience for investigative work. The second one had told her she showed promise, but her communication with supervisors needed development. This was the official way of saying she didn't defer appropriately to people who outranked her, which was the official way of saying she kept pursuing things after she'd been told to stop pursuing them. She'd spent 3 days after the second rejection genuinely considering whether she'd gotten it wrong, whether the problem was her, whether the appropriate response to being told that Blackridge Pass freight irregularities were not her concern was to believe that they weren't her concern. Spent 3 days on it, and then she'd driven to the records annex. How long were you in the cabin? She said. Luke didn't take his eyes off the ridgeline. I told you, 3 years. Before the cabin. After the 12 years. A long silence, not the kind that meant he was refusing. Kind that meant he was deciding how to go at it. 8 months, he said, between the end of service and the cabin. I was in Cheyenne for a while. Then I wasn't good at being in Cheyenne. She could imagine what that looked like. She'd known men who'd come back from long operational deployments and tried to live in cities and what it did to them, the specific friction of civilian proximity after years of existing in small teams in controlled environments. The way crowds felt like threats and noise felt like incoming, and the absence of a clear mission felt like drowning in slow motion. Cabin helped, she said. The cabin was something to build, he said. That helped. She looked at the modifications she'd seen, the exits, the sensor array, The weapons placement. The secondary shelter, 2 miles through a blizzard. Topographic maps with their penciled notations. Theed intervened. She thought about a man spending 3 years building out a defensive network around a mountain cabin because he needed something to do with a trained mind that didn't have an operational context anymore. Trauma of it was embedded in the practical details, which was a very specific kind of trauma. You built a life-size contingency plan, she said. He looked at her then. What? She said. That's a good way to put it. He looked away. Didn't think it would ever actually run. The sound reached them before the light did rotors, the heavy sustained thrum of a military utility helicopter, working hard against the altitude and the residual wind, coming from the south at low altitude. Then the searchlight came over the southern ridgeline and painted the service flat white, and the downdraft hit them like a wall, driving the loose snow sideways. And Ranger pressed flat to the ground, and Claire shielded her eyes, and Luke stood up from his position and raised both arms straight overhead. The helicopter descended. It was not a graceful landing. Pilot was fighting the altitude and the surface wind and the residual turbulence off the ridgeline, and the skids touched down hard on the left side first and bounced once before settling. The rotor wash was deafening and freezing, and the searchlight was pointed straight down and filling the flat with reflected light that made everything look overexposed. 4 people came off the bird fast, 2 in tactical gear, weapons up, moving immediately to the north ridgeline to cover the approach. A 3rd in a flight suit, and a 4th in civilian clothes, a heavy winter jacket, no visible weapon, who moved directly toward Luke with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been looking forward to this conversation. The man was mid-50s, gray at the temples. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away by default, which was a trained quality, not a natural one. Stopped in front of Luke and looked at him for a moment. Mercer, he said. Rains, Luke said, you look like hell. I've looked worse. Rains looked at Claire. At the badge on her jacket, partly obscured by the compression bandage and the general deterioration of the night. At Ranger, who was still pressed flat against the ground, because the rotor wash hadn't let up entirely. Deputy Maddox, Rains said. It wasn't a question. Who are you? She said. Someone who needs what you're carrying, he said. And who has the clearance to receive it? She looked at Luke. He's good, Luke said, simply. She unzipped the vest pocket and held out the USB drive. Rains took it, looked at it once, put it in an interior jacket pocket. We need to move, he said. Your contractors are 2 ridgelines west and pulling back, but I'd rather not be on this mountain longer than necessary. He looked at Ranger. The dog needs a vet. I know, Claire said. We have a veterinary contact at Silver Creek Regional. That's 42. We're flying. He turned to Luke. Coming. I'll wait for Mercer. Rain's voice didn't change register. It didn't need to. You're coming. Luke looked at the mountain. At the cabin position, which was dark and distant, and she now understood, was never going to look the same to him, regardless of whether they let him go back to it. Something had ended up here tonight that he'd been carefully maintaining for 3 years, the productive isolation, the controlled distance, the contingency plan that was never supposed to run. It had run. And now the man who'd built it was standing in a helicopter's wash on a mountain in the breaking dark, and someone from his former life was telling him it was time to go. He picked up the go bag. They moved to the helicopter. Silver Creek Regional Medical Center had the particular fluorescent exhaustion of a rural hospital at 4 a.m, thin staff, ambient quiet broken by the occasional overhead page, the smell of antiseptic and industrial coffee, and the specific human staleness of a building that never fully aired out. Claire sat in a plastic chair outside the trauma bay, and someone had given her a blanket, and had given her coffee, and she was holding both without using either. Yes, he'd intervened. Her knee was elevated on the chair across from her at the insistence of a nurse who'd taken one look at it and produced an ice pack before Claire had finished, explaining she was fine. Ranger was in surgery. It was not serious surgery. The shoulder wound had been assessed by the veterinary contact, a compact woman named Dr. Felice, who had arrived at the hospital ahead of the helicopter somehow, and had taken Ranger from Claire's side at the landing pad with a calm professional authority that had been one of the more comforting things Claire had experienced in the past several hours. The surgery was a cleaning and closure. He would be out in 90 minutes. Trauma Bay had taken the cut above Claire's temple, and the shoulder and the knee in sequence the shoulder confirming Luke's field diagnosis, and the knee being described by the attending as a grade 2 MCL sprain that would require a brace and 6 weeks of doing 18 things she was not temperamentally suited to doing. Luke had a cut above his ear that took 4 stitches and a right knee that the attending had wanted to image, and Luke had declined. Yes, he'd intervened, which the attending had noted in the chart with the resigned precision of someone who'd dealt with this particular argument before. Yep, Rains was in a conference room down the hall with 2 people who'd arrived by car while the helicopter was still inbound. Federal agents, from the look of them, not local, state. The specific calibration of federal. They'd taken the USB drive and a preliminary statement from Claire in the first 20 minutes, using tunfrations. A woman named Solis doing most of the talking, while a man named Garrett took notes on a tablet and asked occasional clarifying questions in the flat, patient way of someone who already knew most of the answers and was establishing the record. The statement had taken 40 minutes. They'd come back twice with follow-up questions. The third time they came back, they brought a man Claire didn't recognize, who said very little, but whose presence in the room caused both Solis and Garrett to arrange their posture differently. After the third session, Solis sat down across from Claire in the plastic chairs and looked at her with the frank assessment of a professional who decided to stop managing the conversation and just have it. The chain of custody issue, Solis said. I know, Claire said. You accessed municipal contract records that were not directly relevant to any active investigation you were authorized to run. I accessed public records during personal time. Some of them were public. Permit authorization files were in a restricted access annex. The annex access requires a county employee badge. I have a county employee badge. Solis looked at her steadily. Deputy, the recs were physically accessible to any county employee who swiped their badge and walked in during business hours, Claire said. I didn't break anything to get in. I didn't copy protected digital files. I photographed paper records in a room I had legal access to. Soft photographs of your personal property. The chain of custody for a federal proceeding requires. What it requires. Claire set the coffee down on the chair next to her, which freed her hand to make a gesture she almost made and then didn't. The chain is complicated. I've known that since week 6. I went anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant those routes kept running, and whatever is moving through them kept moving. She looked at Solis directly. Tell me I made the wrong call. Solis was quiet for a moment. I'm not here to evaluate your judgment. Then why bring up the chain of custody? Because the people who are going to challenge this evidence are going to use it. And I need to know whether you understood the exposure before you proceeded. I understood it, and you proceeded anyway. Yes. Silence. Solis glanced at the tablet in her hand at something on its screen. The financial routing documents, she said. The one showing Blackridge consolidated as a co-signatory on the municipal contracts. Yes, there are 17. Yes, we've had Blackridge consolidated on a watch list for 14 months, Solis said. Claire stared at her. Not for permit fraud, Solis said. For something larger. The freight routing you identified intersects with a pattern we've been building from the federal end. Your 4 months of work. She paused, choosing something carefully. Fills a gap we haven't been able to fill from our end because we didn't have access to the county-level permit records. You didn't have access to county permit records. Public records requests to Cedar Hollow County have gone unanswered for 8 months. Twice, we had a legal avenue we were preparing, but Solis stopped. But it was going to take time, Claire said. And my photographs are faster. Photographs, combined with the transaction records and the route logs and the authorization signatures, give us a case we can actually take into a courtroom. Solis held her gaze. Chain of custody issue is real. I'm not minimizing it. But there are ways to work with what you've built. Our team has done it before, with evidence gathered under complicated circumstances. Claire sat with this for a moment. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed. 14 months, she said. Been building this for 14 months, and you needed county-level permit records, and no one thought to ask a county deputy to. No. About you, Solis said, with the directness of someone who decided the honest version was more useful. We didn't know anyone inside Cedar Hollow had identified the pattern. Our assumption was that anyone in the county system was either compromised or would become compromised if we made contact. She paused. We were wrong about that. Claire looked at the wall. Nothing in particular on the wall. Dennis Terrace, she said. Excuse me, Deputy Dennis Terrace, checkpoint deputy. Medical leave since April. She looked at Solis. He's not just a compromised employee. He's a witness. He stamped those loads because someone told him to. And if someone told him to, it means he can tell you who told him. Solis made a note on the tablet. We'll find him. Be careful when you do. The reason he went on medical leave in April is the same reason I went off a mountain road tonight. Solis looked up from the tablet. The professional distance in her face dropped by one clear increment. Understood, she said set. She left, and Claire sat alone in the plastic chair with the cold coffee and the ice pack on her knee and the blanket across her shoulders. Yes, he'd intervened, and the exhaustion settled into her like something that had been waiting politely outside the door for hours, and had finally been let in. Luke appeared at the end of the hallway. He walked toward her with the right knee visibly managed, a 4-stitch cut above his ear with a small white dressing on it, wearing a hospital-issue sweatshirt that someone had given him to replace the one that had been written on by the ER. He sat down in the chair beside her, not the one with the ice pack on it, and was quiet. She looked at him, at the dressing, at the right knee. How long has that been a problem, she said. The knee? 3 years. Since the cabin. Since before the cabin. I just manage it differently up here. She didn't ask what had happened to it. He'd tell her or he wouldn't. Raines wants a debrief, he said. I know, he already has my statement. A debrief. He looked at his hands. He wants to know about the cabin, the secondary shelter, the sensor array. A pause. He says the way I had that position set up saved your life and the evidence, and he wants it on record. And you don't want it on record. I want to go back up there, and he stopped. I built that position for a specific reason. I know. The specific reason was that I didn't want to be operational anymore. And now Raines has me in a federal medical center at 5 in the morning giving a debrief. She looked at him, at the controlled stillness of him, which she now understood was not introversion and not coldness, but the specific discipline of a man who'd trained himself to contain a very loud interior life. She said he looked at her. Tell him no on the operational debrief. Give him what you want to give him and nothing else. She pulled the blanket tighter. You're a civilian who assisted a law enforcement officer in a remote rescue situation. You're not an asset. Something moved in his face. Relief. He was too controlled for relief to show cleanly. But something adjacent. He's not going to accept that framing, Luke said. He's going to have to not accept it without your cooperation. She met his gaze. You said the drive gets off the mountain. It did. What happens after that isn't your mission. He was quiet for a moment. The hospital hummed around them. A cart moved past in the corridor, and the person pushing it glanced at them and looked away. Raines is going to offer me something, Luke said. An advisory position, she said. I'd guess. Yeah. Are you going to take it? He was quiet long enough that the question settled and aged in the air between them. She nodded. I know what that looks like from the outside, he said. You're not walking away from anything. You're going back to your cabin. She looked at him. There's a difference. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression she'd seen, the adjustment of an expectation she couldn't quite identify. What did Solis say, he said? That my 4 months of work fills a gap they've had for 14 months. She looked at the floor. The chain of custody is complicated but workable. It is, I paused, she'd said. She also said they've had Blackridge consolidated on a watch list for 14 months and nobody knew about me. That bother you? She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. Spent 4 months thinking I was the only one who saw it. Turns out I was just the only one who could see it from where I was standing. She was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. Down the hall a door opened and Dr. Felice's tear appeared, still in scrubs, and crossed to where they were sitting with the direct stride of someone who delivered information efficiently. He's out, she said. Surgery went clean. He'll be in recovery for a few hours, and then we'll get him comfortable. She looked at Claire. He did well. Strong dog. I know, Claire said. And then, because she was exhausted, and it had been a very long night, and she was past the point of managing her own responses, her eyes went wet and she looked at the ceiling and blinked twice. Dr. Felice put a hand on her shoulder briefly, and then was gone. Luke sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. Yes, he'd intervened. After a moment, she brought her eyes back down and looked at the hallway, and got her breathing back to something regular. I'm going to need to find a new route home, she said. Her voice was even. Blackridge Pass is closed anyway. Storm debris. Yeah, she exhaled slowly. I'm also probably going to need a new vehicle. Probably. And a new radio. She looked at him sideways. This is funny to you. A little, he said. And the corner of his mouth moved in a way she hadn't seen it move before. It was small. It lasted about 2 seconds. But it changed his face entirely briefly, before the control came back. She looked away before he noticed she'd seen it. Rains peered with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had decided to let the conversation he wanted to have wait until people who he needed to have it with were marginally more functional. He sat down across from them. The contractors are in federal custody as of 40 minutes ago, he said. All 5. The 2 who were already coming down the mountain for extraction came down into a state police perimeter on the highway. He looked at Luke, the one in the snow with the shoulder wound. He'll need surgery, but he'll be fine. Luke nodded. Crane's attorneys have been contacted, Rains said. He doesn't know what's on the drive yet. He will by morning. By morning, his attorneys will be trying to build the chain of custody argument, Claire said. By morning, my team will be executing warrants on Blackridge Consolidated's records in 3 states, Rains said. Chain of custody is a courtroom problem. The warrants are an evidence problem. We fix the evidence problem, and the courtroom problem becomes manageable. He looked at her steadily. You did good work, Deputy. She looked at him. I did 4 months of unauthorized work that nobody asked me to do. He said, that's what I said. She held his gaze. He didn't look away. Crane's going to federal court, he said. The evidence you built is the foundation of that case. Everything we've been building for 14 months becomes more solid because of what you gathered. He paused. Someone said to know. I don't say lightly, and I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's factually accurate, and because you need to understand the value of what you did when certain people in your department start making the argument that you exceeded your authority. And will they, she said, make that argument? Some of them will. He said it without apology. People who were comfortable with the status quo on Blackridge Pass are going to look for a way to make this about your conduct rather than theirs. He looked at her. Be ready for that. She was quiet. I'm ready for that, she said. He held her gaze for one more moment, then nodded once and stood. Get some sleep, he said, both of you. I'll need full statements at 9. He looked at Luke. An operational debrief. Statements. Whatever you're comfortable providing. Looked at him. I'm not here to pull you back in, Rain said quietly. I know what you built up there. I know why you built it. He stopped. Just statements. Luke nodded. Intervened. Rains walked back toward the conference room, and the corridor settled into its fluorescent quiet, and Claire leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She was asleep in under a minute. Her coffee went cold beside her. Her knee throbbed steadily under the ice pack. Luke stayed awake. He watched the corridor and kept the North Ridgeline habit alive in the back of his mind, monitoring, scanning the exits and the approaches because some things didn't turn off cleanly, and he'd stopped trying to make them. Outside the hospital windows, Wyoming dark was beginning very slowly to show its edge. The dawn came in sideways through the hospital windows, pale and watery, the specific gray gold of a Wyoming morning after a storm when the sky isn't sure yet whether it's done with you. Watched it arrive. He'd been awake for most of it, not anxious, vigilant in the operational sense, just awake the way he was always awake in the hours before sunrise. A habit his body had maintained through 12 years of military service and 3 years of mountain solitude alike. A clock that reset every morning regardless of what the night before had asked of it. He'd sat in the plastic chair and let Claire sleep beside him, and watched the corridor and thought about the ridge and the contractors in federal custody and Rains in the conference room and the USB drive in Solis's evidence bag. He'd intervened, and somewhere in the middle of all that thinking he'd stopped and just watched the light change on the window glass. 6:47, Claire woke up. She came out of sleep the same way she did everything without transition, fully present. Her eyes opened and she looked at the corridor, and then at him, and then at the window. How long was I out, she said. Little under 2 hours. She reached up and touched the dressing on her temple. Checked the ice pack on her knee, which had gone warm and soft. She looked like a person who had been in a vehicle crash and a blizzard and a gunfight in the same night, which was exactly what she was. And she sat up straight anyway. Ranger, she said, still in recovery. Dr. Felice came by an hour ago. Said he was doing well. She sat back. The statement, she said. 9 o'clock, 40 minutes. She stood, tested the knee. It held, barely, with the brace the ER nurse had fitted before midnight. She took 3 experimental steps toward the window and came back. Workable, she said, mostly to herself. Luke looked at her. You don't have to project competence in here. She stopped, looked at him. There's nobody watching, he said. She sat back down, not because he'd given her permission. She wasn't the kind of person who needed permission. But something in the directness of it reached past the reflex, and she sat down and let the knee rest for another few minutes. Keep thinking about something, Solis said. She told him. 14 months. They had Blackridge consolidated for 14 months, and the case wouldn't move. Till it did, because of 4 months of work that nobody authorized. She stared at the window. I keep running the math on that and getting an answer I don't know what to do with. What's the answer? That the systems we build to pursue the truth have a structural ceiling. And sometimes the only way past the ceiling is someone who doesn't know it's there, or knows it's there and goes through it anyway. She paused. Which is either heroic or reckless depending on who's doing the evaluation. It's usually both, Luke said. She looked at him. Did anyone ever evaluate you that way? He thought about this with the honest engagement he gave every question she asked him, which she'd come to recognize as a particular quality of his. He didn't dismiss anything as rhetorical, he said several times. He looked at the window. The evaluations were positive when the outcomes were good. When the outcomes were complicated, the evaluations got complicated too. And did the outcomes ever? Yes, he said. And the door he'd half opened closed cleanly, without force, and she let it. The statements took 3 hours instead of 1. Solis ran Claire's first, in a small conference room with a recorder and a transcript running simultaneously, and she went through everything from the beginning. The speeding ticket in March, the mismatched manifest, the first trip to the county annex, the 17 contracts. The camera pointed at the wall. She said all of it in the same order she'd assembled it over 4 months, and Solis asked precise questions, and Garrett typed. And the man who'd come in during the 3rd session the night before was there again, in the corner of the room, not recording, just listening. She asked who he was. Solis said, someone who needed to hear this directly. The man said, Deputy Maddox, and stopped, and then said, the authorization signature on 12 of the 17 contracts belongs to Deputy County Administrator Ray Purcell. He said it the way people said things they'd been waiting to say for a while. We've had Purcell on the edge of 2 prior investigations and couldn't make anything stick. Your photograph of his signature on the Blackridge Consolidated Co-Agreements is the first direct documentary link we've had. Claire looked at him. Ray Purcell. Yes, she sat with that. Ray Purcell was 62 years old and had been with the county administration for 19 years and went to the same church as the county sheriff and had coached youth baseball for a decade and had a particular way of passing her in the hallway. The municipal building that she had always read as condescension and now understood was something else. About me, she said. Almost certainly, the man said. Someone informed Crane you were leaving Ridgewood with the evidence. Purcell had access to the annex system logs. He would have seen your badge swipes. She thought about the camera pointed at the wall, about the 3 weeks between that visit and last night. 3 weeks in which she'd continued driving to work and filing reports and eating lunch at the same diner on Thursday afternoons and doing everything a person did when they believed they were being careful and didn't know that the people they were being careful around had already seen through the careful. He waited, she said. Until you had everything in one place, the man said. Then he moved. She looked at Solis. Purcell's being detained? As of this morning, Solis said, along with the checkpoint supervisor who managed Terrace's shifts, and 2 members of the county transportation board who appear on the permit authorization chain. And Crane's attorneys are with him now. A pause. They're telling him the evidence is circumstantial and the chain of custody is vulnerable. No. Are they right? Solis looked at her steadily. The statement ended at noon. Claire walked out of the conference room and into the corridor and stood there, one hand on the wall, not because her knee was failing, but because the weight of the morning had settled in a particular way and she needed a moment with it. Luke was in the corridor. He'd finished his statement an hour earlier and was leaning against the wall with a paper cup of coffee that had clearly been there long enough to be cold, doing nothing in the specific unhurried way he did nothing. Purcell, she said. He looked at her. You heard from out here? The door's not that thick. She looked at the conference room door. It was a standard interior door. Purcell, she said again, trying the name in a different register. Crane needed someone inside the county structure. Purcell needed something Crane could provide. Luke shrugged. A minimal movement. That's how it usually works. Have you seen it before? Variations. She looked down the corridor. Where's Raines? Left an hour ago. Said to tell you the warrants are executing in 3 states and he'd be intervening to the federal case coordinator. A pause. He left you his direct number. He held out a card. She took it and looked at it and put it in her jacket pocket. What did he say to you? She said. Luke looked at the cold coffee. He said the offer stands. Advisory capacity. Consulting on specific operations, nothing ongoing. He turned the cup slightly in his hands. He said he'd give me 6 months to think about it. And you told him? I told him 6 months was generous. She almost smiled. That's not an answer, I know. She looked at him. He looked at the coffee cup. The hospital hummed. He looked up. The cabin's going to need repairs, she said. He looked at her carefully. I know, 3 windows. A front door, probably. Generator line, and the south wall framing, where the smoke grenade was near enough to damage the insulation. Paused. You going back? He looked at her for a long moment, and in the look was something she was beginning to understand about him, that he said more in the length and quality of his silences than most people said with words. He said. She nodded. Good. He looked slightly surprised that she'd said good. She was slightly surprised herself. The cabin's not the problem, she said. Cabin is the most practical place you've ever lived. 3 exits and a sensor array, and 4 miles from the nearest person who could bother you. She met his eyes. Go fix the windows, he looked at her. The offer, she said. Raines, you should take the 6 months. You just said. I said go fix the windows. That's not inconsistent with thinking about a consulting role that you can run from a cabin in Wyoming. She shrugged, which hurt her shoulder, and she didn't let it show. 6 months is a long time. Fix the windows. Think about it. Something in him settled, incrementally, the way weight settled on solid ground. I'll think about it, he said, which from him, she was learning, was a more significant statement than it sounded. Ranger was released from the surgical recovery ward at 2 in the afternoon. He came out on a soft lead with Dr. Felice beside him, a bandage on his left shoulder that was clean and white, and already being investigated with mild suspicion by his nose. He walked with a deliberate, careful gait that reflected both the sedation wearing off and the professional dignity of a dog who did not intend to display vulnerability. He found Claire immediately, crossed to her in 3 careful strides, and pressed his head against her midsection, and she put both hands on him, the bad shoulder and the good one, and didn't say anything for a moment. Sutures in 10 days, Dr. Felice said. Restricted activity for 3 weeks. I know what restricted means for a working dog. I mean it. Claire said. The foreleg is soft tissue bruising. Resolve. She looked at the bandage. He's a strong animal. The wound was clean. He's going to be completely fine. Claire said again. Dr. Felice looked at her, and then at Ranger, and then left them alone, which was the right thing to do. Luke stood back. He watched Claire with the dog, and he didn't make it a thing, just stood back and gave it the space it needed. After a moment, Claire straightened. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks for him, Luke said. MCL is 6, I know. You're going to be a terrible patient. Probably. At 4 in the afternoon, a Cedar Hollow County Sheriff's Department vehicle pulled into the Silver Creek Regional Medical Center parking lot, and Sheriff Dale Whitmore got out of it. Claire saw him through the lobby window. She knew Dale Whitmore. Everyone in Cedar Hollow County law enforcement knew Dale Whitmore. He'd been sheriff for 11 years, was up for re-election in November, had a handshake that went on slightly too long, and a way of remembering every deputy's kid's name and birthday that was either genuine warmth or very disciplined political competence. And she had never been entirely sure which. He'd been the one to tell her, the second time, that she showed promise but needed to develop her communication with supervisors. He'd said it with a look on his face that she'd read as apologetic and had filed away. She met him in the lobby. No, he came in through the automatic doors and stopped when he saw her, the brace on the knee, the dressing on the temple, the sling the ER had put on her shoulder that she'd taken off but was carrying, the general evidence of a night that had tried hard to be her last. His face did something that she watched carefully and decided was genuine. Claire, he said. Sheriff, he looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at Luke, who was standing 20 feet back in the lobby with the go-bag at his feet and Ranger sitting beside him. They briefed me this morning, Whitmore said. Federal called. He looked back at her. Ray Purcell. Yes. He absorbed this the way you absorbed something that rearranged a significant portion of your understanding of the last decade of your professional life. She watched him absorb it and didn't rush it. How long did you know? He said. It was Purcell specifically until this morning, she said. I knew the permits were going through county administration. I didn't know who. He nodded slowly. The investigation. The 4 months. Yes, you didn't come to me. She held his gaze. He could take that however he chose to take it. She wasn't going to explain or soften it. He was the man who'd told her. The freight irregularities weren't her concern, and she'd been right that they were, and they both knew it now. You see, yes demeaned, and the question of whether she should have trusted him with it 4 months ago was a question she'd asked herself honestly and come up with an honest answer. The honest answer was no, 'cause she'd known he was compromised. He wasn't, apparently. Or at least not in the ways that mattered, but because she hadn't known he wasn't, and the cost of being wrong about it was everything. The detective position, Whitmore said. His voice was careful. There's been a vacancy since March. Hanson's retirement. She looked at him. The review board reconvenes in 6 weeks, he said. I'm recommending your name. She was quiet. I know that's not. Started again. You did the job was supposed to do. I should have. He stopped again. He was not a man who found apology natural. She could see that he was trying to get there anyway, which she gave him credit for. I'm sorry it took this to make me see it. She thought about what to say. Seat thought about the 2 rejection letters and the official language about promise and communication and supervisor relationships. Teat. She thought about 4 months of personal time investigation and the camera pointed at the wall and the road off Blackridge Pass and the blizzard and the knee and Ranger's shoulder. And meant it. Not because she needed his recommendation, and not because the detective position was the point of any of it. Because he was standing in a hospital lobby, trying to say something true, and that was worth acknowledging. Looked at Luke again. Who is he? Whitmore said quietly. Someone who lives on the mountain, she said. Whitmore looked at her, at the inadequacy of that description versus the obvious reality, and decided to leave it. He left. She found Luke outside in the parking lot, standing in the afternoon light with Ranger on the lead beside him. Temperature had risen enough that the air was above freezing for the first time in 36 hours, and the parking lot snow was going soft at the edges, the kind of melt that happened on the surface while the ground beneath stayed locked. He was looking at the mountains. She stood beside him and looked at them too. The Blackridge Range was visible from here 20 miles north, a white serrated line against the winter blue, looking precisely like nothing had happened on it in the past 24 hours. What did the sheriff want? Luke said, to apologize. To offer me a detective position. A pause. You going to take it? Yes. She said it without having consciously decided it, which meant she'd decided it somewhere earlier in the day without noticing. I think I am. Good. She looked at him. Why good? Because you're good at it. He said it simply. Not the part where you follow the rules. Part where you see something that's wrong and you don't stop. She looked at the mountains. My supervisor used to call that a communication problem, she said. Your supervisor was wrong. She let that sit for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the snow on the distant ridgeline, turning it from white to a pale gold, the kind of color that only happened in that brief window of winter afternoon before the cold came back. Cabin, she said. I'll head back up tomorrow. Should be passable by morning. The service road on the south side. I'll go around. He looked at her sideways. There are other routes. The mountain. I know you do. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to give a deposition in about 3 weeks when the federal case formally opens. Solis said there may be additional questions as the case develops. She paused. Could go on for a while. Cases like this usually do. Right. She looked at Ranger, who was sitting with his bandaged shoulder toward the sun, in the manner of a dog who had located the warmest available position and intended to stay in it. The sutures are in 10 days. You'll be busy, Luke said. In 10 days, yes. After 10 days, less so. She looked at the mountains. Restricted activity for 3 weeks. For him. For both of us, really. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones they'd had in the shelter and the cabin and the hospital corridor. Those had been silences with things in them, compressed things, information and assessment, and the specific weight of two people figuring out whether they could trust each other in a rapidly deteriorating situation. This one was quieter, more room in it. There are other routes up to the cabin, she said. Just Blackridge Pass. He looked at her. I'm just observing, she said. Just observing. No, she agreed. I'm not. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridge line. Then he said the access road on the north side is rough in spring. Ice melt makes it unpredictable. I have a four-wheel drive. Not anymore. You don't. She'd forgotten about the cruiser. I will have one. Eventually, he looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. The same movement as in the hospital corridor, small and brief and genuine. The south approach is better after March, he said. The grade is easier, and there's a turnout at the 2-mile mark where the view opens up. He looked back at the mountains. It's a good view, she nodded. I'll fix the windows first, he said. That seems like the right order, she said. Victor Crane was formally charged in federal court 11 days later. Claire was in a physical therapy appointment. When she got the notification, a text from Solis that said simply warrants executed, charges filed, arraignment Thursday, and she looked at her phone and then set it down on the PT table and told the therapist she needed a minute. And the therapist, who had learned over 11 days that Claire needed minutes occasionally and that asking about them was not productive, left her alone. She sat in the small room with the resistance bands and the foam rollers and the chart of knee anatomy on the wall. And she thought about the moment in March when she'd written a speeding ticket to a Crane transport driver on Blackridge Pass, and the manifest hadn't matched the way station record. She tried to locate what she'd felt in that moment, whether there had been some premonition, some anticipatory knowledge of what the thread would lead to if she pulled it. There hadn't been. She'd just pulled the thread because the thread was there, and it was wrong, and she was a cop, was all it was. That was also everything it was. The charges against Crane were federal trafficking facilitation, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, obstruction of federal investigation, 17 counts total. Yes, he'd intervened, a number that would have been symbolic, if it weren't for the fact that it was also specifically the number of municipal contracts in the chain that Claire had documented. Coincidence of the number was not lost on her. She filed it under the category of things that felt meaningful, but were probably just math. Ray Purcell pleaded out 3 days after arraignment. Cooperation with federal prosecutors, in exchange for a reduced sentence, produced 2 additional co-conspirators, that the federal team hadn't identified a state transportation official and a logistics coordinator at a freight terminal in Rock Springs who had been managing the weight manifest falsifications for 31 months. 31 months. The whole thing had been running for 2.5 years before anyone pulled the thread. Dennis Terrace, reached by federal investigators at his sister's house in Laramie, where he'd been since April, agreed to cooperate. His testimony about what he'd been told to do at the checkpoint and who had told him was, according to Solis, in a brief call that Claire received while standing in the parking lot of the physical therapy clinic with her brace and her crutch and the March sun on her face, going to be useful. The word she used was useful. The word she meant Claire understood was decisive. Commendation ceremony was on a Wednesday in early April, which turned out to be a day of specific Wyoming spring beauty, cold still. Always cold, clear. The sky a deep and unambiguous blue above the Blackridge Range. Snow on the high peaks reduced from its February volume to something more reasonable, a seasonal negotiation between winter and everything else. County Commission room held 47 people. Claire counted them from the front of the room while the county commissioner read from a prepared statement that was accurate and somewhat formal and would have embarrassed her less if there had been fewer people in the room looking at her knee. Brace and her sling, which she'd put back on because the shoulder still needed it even if she'd stopped wanting to need it. Ranger sat beside her on a mat that someone had placed for him, because K-9 officers attended their own commendations, and he sat with his bandaged shoulder visible and his tail performing its characteristic slow rotation, and he was better at this than she was. Statement talked about courage and integrity and commitment to duty under extraordinary circumstances. It used the word extraordinary 3 times. She counted those 2. When it was over and people were standing and someone was taking photographs, Whitmore came over and shook her hand and said, Detective Maddox, and the title was not official. Yet the review board was in 2 weeks, but it was close enough that saying it wasn't inaccurate. She said, "Thank you, Dale." He looked slightly startled by the first name. She'd never used it before. Then the crowd shifted, and she found herself by the window with Ranger and the sun on both of them. And she looked out at the parking lot and at the mountains beyond it, the Blackridge Range, white and distant and completely indifferent to everything that had happened on its eastern face in February. Solis was there. She'd driven up from Cheyenne for it, which Claire hadn't expected. Solis found her at the window and said, "Federal charges were amended this morning. 4 additional counts. The Rock Springs coordinator gave us the facility locations." She said it quietly, the way you delivered information rather than news. "We have the destinations." Claire looked at her. "The missing piece." Yes, she looked at the mountains. What were they moving? Solis was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant the answer was available. But the full version of it was either classified or would take longer than the window of a commendation ceremony to properly contextualize. "Equipment," Solis had said, "and materials for facilities that now appear on 3 federal agency watch lists." She looked at Claire. "What you told Mercer in the shelter, your theory about the weight discrepancies and the nighttime routes and the unlicensed facilities." "I told him I couldn't prove the destination. You were right about everything except that part." Solis paused. "The destination is going to add federal charges that make the original count look modest." Claire absorbed this. She looked at the mountains. "He built it over 2.5 years, she said. "He built it over 4 years, Solis said. "The first 18 months were set up, acquiring the infrastructure, placing the people. By the time your checkpoint deputy was stamping loads, the network was already fully operational. 4 years. She thought about all the Thursday afternoon lunches at the diner and all the Blackridge Pass patrol shifts and all the normal operational time of a county deputy doing county deputy work. And somewhere underneath all of that, for 4 years, this had been running. "See it," she said. "You did," Solis said. "Better than never." Solis looked at her directly. "And better than any of us." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded. Solis left. The room began to thin. Someone collected the mat that Ranger had been sitting on, and he moved to Claire's side and sat on the floor instead, his tail slower now, the event mode energy fading toward his more characteristic, watchful calm. She reached down and put her hand on his head. He was thinner than he'd been in February. The surgery and the recovery and the restricted activity had taken something off him that would come back when he was fully working again. But for now, he was a slightly reduced version of himself that was still completely himself, which she understood as a specific kind of resilience that didn't require the loss to be undone. She looked at her phone, no messages. She sent one instead. Number she'd put in her phone 11 days ago and hadn't used yet. Windows fixed? She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the crutch and walked toward the exit with Ranger beside her. Her phone buzzed before she reached the door. 2 of 3. North wall framing is taking longer. She looked at this for a moment. Then she typed South Access Road. After March, you said. A longer pause this time. She pushed through the exit door into the April sun. The phone buzzed. It's after March. She stood in the parking lot with the mountains in front of her and Ranger beside her and the sun on her face, and she read the message twice. Then she put her phone away and walked to her car, a borrowed county vehicle, her own still pending insurance resolution. And she put Ranger in the back and got in the front and sat there for a moment before starting it. The mountains were very clear today. The kind of clear you only got after a hard winter began to release its hold, every edge sharp, every ridgeline defined, the Blackridge Range showing all its detail instead of hiding it under weather. She started the car. She didn't start it toward Cedar Hollow. She started it north. Some people spend their whole lives believing that power and position protect the guilty. They do sometimes. They do until someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove decides that the thread is there and it's wrong. Pulling it is the only choice that lets them look at themselves in the morning. People everyone counts out are sometimes exactly the ones the count was made for.